Starting today, you're my girlfriend. He didn't ask. He decided. Nina Carter didn't move. She stood a few steps inside the dining room, hands still at her sides, trying to decide if she had just heard something real or something that only sounded real because of the man who said it. Victor Moretti didn't repeat himself. He simply watched her. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake," Nina said, her tone careful but not weak. "I'm staff." "I'm aware," he replied. That was it. No explanation, no softening. Nina let out a quiet breath. "Then I don't understand why you'd say something like that." Victor reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thin, neatly prepared document, not a piece of paper, a contract. He walked over and placed it on the table between them, sliding it slightly in her direction. "Read it." Nina hesitated, then stepped closer. The paper was thick, formal, the kind used for legal agreements. Her name was printed clearly at the top. Her fingers tightened slightly as she picked it up. "Temporary personal arrangement," she read under her breath. "Duration, 7 days." Her eyes moved faster. "Compensation, $200,000. She stopped. "200,000? She repeated, looking up at him. "For 1 week, Victor said. "If the arrangement extends, the rate increases accordingly." Nina stared at him, trying to see if there was any sign this was a joke. There wasn't. "You're serious?" "Yes. This is," she exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You're asking me to pretend to be your girlfriend." "I'm asking you to solve a problem," he corrected. "That's not my problem." "It is now," he said calmly. Nina lowered the contract, her pulse beginning to pick up. "You can't just decide that." "I already did." The words weren't aggressive. That made them worse. She glanced back down at the paper, at the number that didn't feel real. $200,000. "For 1 week," she said again, quieter now. Victor leaned one hand against the table. "That amount would cover your father's current treatment plan. It would also allow for additional procedures your insurance has already declined." Nina's head snapped up. "How do you know about my father? I make it a point to know who works in my house." "That's not work-related," she said, sharper now. "It is when it affects your decisions." She took a step back, the contract still in her hand. "You looked into my life. I confirmed information. That's not better." Victor didn't argue. "He's at Mercy Hospital, cardiology. His condition isn't stable." Nina's grip tightened around the paper. "You don't get to use that against me." "I'm not using it," he said. "I'm acknowledging it." "That's the same thing." "No," Victor replied, his voice steady. "Using it would mean forcing you. This is an offer." She let out a short breath. "It doesn't feel like one." "That's because you don't like the terms." "I don't like any of it." Victor nodded once, as if that answer made sense to him. "Then don't accept." The simplicity of it caught her off guard. Nina looked back down at the contract. Legal language, clean structure, no hidden clauses she could immediately see, just a clear exchange. Time, money, role. Her chest tightened slightly. "Why me?" "You're new," he said. "You're not connected to anyone in my world. No expectations, no history. So I'm disposable." "You're reliable," he corrected. "That's not the compliment you think it is." Victor didn't react to that. "My family is arranging meetings. They expect me to choose a wife. I'm not interested in their options. So you hire one instead?" "I choose one," he said. "There's a difference." Nina shook her head. "Not from where I'm standing." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You're capable of doing this without making it complicated. That's your assumption. It's based on observation." Nina almost laughed, but it didn't quite come out right. "You've known me, 10 days? Long enough." Silence settled between them, not heavy, but focused. Nina looked again at the number on the page, 200,000. She tried to push the thought away, but it came back anyway. Hospital bills, medication, time her father didn't have. "Bills don't wait," Victor said, as if reading her thoughts. She looked at him, a little too quickly. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make it sound reasonable." "It is reasonable." "It's not normal." "I didn't say it was." That answer stayed with her longer than the others. Nina folded the contract slightly, then caught herself and flattened it again, smoothing the crease with her fingers. "What exactly would I have to do?" Victor answered without hesitation. "Attend dinners. Meet my family. Stay close enough to be believable. speak when necessary. And that's it? For them, yes. And for you? His expression didn't change. The same. Nina held his gaze, searching for something behind the words. She didn't find much. That might have been the problem. And when the week is over, you return to your position. The agreement ends. Just like that. Yes. She nodded slowly, more to herself than to him. You make it sound very simple. It is. Nina let out a quiet breath. It's not simple for me. Victor's tone shifted slightly, not softer, but more direct. No. For you, it's a decision. She looked down at the contract one last time, then placed it back on the table. I need time. Victor nodded. You have until tonight. Nina turned to leave, then paused at the door. 1 week, she said without turning around. Yes. She hesitated. And if it goes longer, you'll be paid more. That's not what I meant. Victor watched her. Then be clear. Nina finally looked back at him. If it goes longer, does it stop being fake? For the first time, there was the faintest pause. No, he said. The answer came quickly but not instantly. Nina studied his face for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if that was enough. Okay, she said quietly. I'll think about it. She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, closing it behind her with a soft click. The contract remained on the table, but the number on it followed her. Nina didn't go back to work right away. She walked past the staff corridor, past the kitchen where the morning shift had already begun, and stepped outside instead, into the narrow strip of garden behind the estate where no one really paid attention to who came and went. The air was cooler there, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and something sharper, like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She stood still for a moment, arms folded lightly across herself, as if holding something in place that kept shifting inside her. $200,000. 1 week. She tried to say it in her head like it was just a number. It didn't stay that way. Numbers like that didn't belong to people like her. They belonged to decisions other people made, the kind that never reached down to places like her apartment or her father's hospital room. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without checking the screen first. It was the hospital. Nina answered immediately. Hello? Miss Carter? This is Mercy Hospital, billing department. We've been trying to reach you. I know, she said quietly, already closing her eyes. I've just been at work. There's been an update to your father's treatment plan. His cardiologist has recommended an additional procedure. It's not covered under your current policy. Nina leaned back slightly against the cool stone wall behind her. How much? There was a pause, the kind that always came before numbers that changed things. Approximately 87,000. She let out a small breath through her nose. Not shock, not anymore, just recognition. And if we don't do it? She asked. It would significantly reduce his prognosis. That was how they said it. Clean. Professional. No room for emotion. Okay, Nina said, her voice steady. Thank you for letting me know. Miss Carter, I'll call back, she added, then ended the call before she had to hear anything else. The silence that followed felt louder than the conversation. She stared down at her phone for a second longer, then slipped it back into her pocket. Her hands were steady, but it took effort. Everything took effort now. Breathing. Thinking. Standing still without letting something break through. Rough morning? Nina turned slightly at the voice. It was Daniel, one of the groundskeepers, leaning against the side entrance with a coffee cup in hand. Mid-50s, easy posture, the kind of man who had seen enough of life to know when not to ask too many questions. Something like that, she said. He nodded, not pushing. This place does that to people. She almost smiled. It's not the place. No, he said, taking a sip of his coffee. It never is. They stood there for a moment, not talking. It wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet in a way that didn't demand anything. You just started here, right? He asked after a second. 11 days. Still figuring out where everything is. And what everything means, she added. Daniel gave a small huff of amusement. Careful with that part. Around here, things mean more than they look like. Nina glanced toward the house, toward the windows she couldn't see through from this angle. I'm starting to notice. He looked at her for a moment, then said, if someone upstairs asks you to do something that doesn't feel like your job, you ask questions. I did, she said. And? Nina hesitated, then shook her head. Didn't help. Daniel nodded slowly. as if that answer fit exactly where he expected it to. Yeah, that sounds about right. Another silence settled, shorter this time. Well, he said, pushing off the wall. Whatever it is, don't forget you can walk away. Jobs aren't worth losing yourself over. Nina watched him go, the words staying behind longer than she expected. Walk away. She repeated it quietly in her mind. It sounded simple. It always did when someone else said it. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message. She didn't need to open it to know who it was from. You have until tonight. No name, no signature, just certainty. Nina slipped the phone back into her pocket and pushed herself off the wall. Standing still wasn't helping. Thinking in circles wasn't helping. She needed something real, something she could hold on to that wasn't a number or a decision she didn't want to make. She left the estate 20 minutes later, telling the head housekeeper she needed to step out for a personal matter. The woman looked at her for a moment, then simply nodded. No questions. That was another rule of places like this. You saw things. You didn't ask. The bus ride into the city took longer than usual, or maybe it just felt that way. Nina sat by the window, watching the houses thin into storefronts, then into tighter streets and older buildings. Life looked different here, smaller, more familiar. Mercy Hospital stood exactly where it always did, solid and indifferent. Nina walked in without slowing. Past the front desk, past the waiting area filled with people who all looked like they were carrying something heavy they couldn't set down. Her father's room was quiet when she stepped inside. The blinds were half open, letting in a pale slice of daylight. He was asleep, or something close to it, his breathing uneven but steady enough not to trigger alarms. Nina moved closer, setting her bag down on the chair beside the bed. She didn't wake him. Not yet. Instead, she sat. For a while, she just watched him. The lines in his face had deepened over the past months. But there was still something familiar in the way he held himself, even in sleep. He had always been a steady man, the kind who fixed things instead of talking about them. Hey, he said suddenly, his eyes opening just enough to find her. You're here early. Nina smiled softly. I had some time. Work letting you off easy? Something like that. He studied her for a second, longer than usual. You look tired. I'm okay. You always say that, and I'm usually right. He gave a small, weak chuckle, then shifted slightly against the pillow. They talked to you yet? About what? More tests? More plans? He waved a hand slightly, as if brushing it off. Doctors like to keep busy. Nina looked down at her hands. They mentioned something. And? She took a breath. It's expensive. Everything is, he said. She looked back up at him, holding his gaze this time. What if it didn't have to be? He frowned slightly. What does that mean? Nina hesitated. This was the part she hadn't figured out yet. How to say it. How to make it sound like a choice, instead of what it really was. It means, she started, then stopped, choosing her words more carefully. What if I had a way to cover it? Her father watched her closely now. What kind of way? A job, she said. Something temporary. Doing what? Nina almost laughed, but it didn't quite come out. That's the complicated part. He didn't smile back. Then I don't like it. You don't even know what it is. I know you, he said. That's enough. The room went quiet again, but this time it felt different. Closer, harder to breathe in. You raised me to take care of what matters, Nina said softly. I raised you not to disappear while doing it. I'm not disappearing. You're thinking about it, he said. And just like that, Nina is standing at a line most of us hope we never have to face, where love, survival, and identity collide. If this moment hit you, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that make you think a little deeper. Nina didn't answer. Her father let out a slow breath, then reached for her hand. His grip wasn't as strong as it used to be, but it was still there. Still him. Whatever this is, he said quietly, make sure it's something you can walk away from. The words hit deeper than Daniel's had. Nina nodded once, though she wasn't sure it meant agreement. After a while, he drifted back to sleep. Nina sat there a little longer, her hand still resting where his had been. The room felt smaller now, like everything had been narrowed down to a single point she couldn't avoid anymore. $200,000. 1 week. Time. She stood up slowly, picking up her bag. At the door, she paused, looking back at him one last time before stepping out into the hallway. By the time she reached the street, the decision was already forming, even if she hadn't said it out loud yet. Some choices didn't feel like choices. They felt like deadlines, and hers was running out. Nina didn't return to the estate until late afternoon. The drive back felt shorter than the morning, though nothing had actually changed except the weight of the decision sitting quietly inside her. She didn't rush when she stepped through the front doors. People who rushed looked uncertain. She had learned that much already. Instead, she moved the way she always did, calm, controlled, like she belonged there, even if that word still felt borrowed. The house was quieter at that hour. Staff moved in the background, conversations low, footsteps measured. No one stopped her, but a few glanced up, just long enough to notice she had been gone. That was the thing about places like this. Everything was seen. Nothing was said. Victor's office door was closed. Nina stood outside it for a moment, her hand resting lightly at her side. She could still walk away. No one was physically stopping her. The exit was behind her, the same as it had been this morning. The difference was that now she understood exactly what she would be walking away from. Time. She lifted her hand and knocked once. "Come in." His voice was the same. Calm. Certain. As if the outcome had already been decided hours ago. Nina opened the door and stepped inside. Victor was standing near the window this time, not behind his desk. The city stretched out beyond the glass, distant and controlled, just like everything else in his world. He didn't turn immediately when she entered. He already knew it was her. "You took longer than I expected," he said. "I went to the hospital." That made him turn. There was no visible reaction, but his attention sharpened slightly. "And?" Nina stepped further into the room, stopping a few feet away from him. "They want to schedule another procedure." "They will," he said. "It's necessary. It's expensive." Yes. There was no sympathy in the word, just acknowledgement. Nina let out a small breath. "You already knew that too. I make it a point to know outcomes before they happen. That must make things easier. It makes them predictable." She nodded slowly, as if that answer settled something. It didn't. The contract was on the desk where he had left it, untouched, waiting. Nina walked toward it, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper before she picked it up again. It felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. 200,000, she said quietly. "For 1 week," Victor replied. "And if it goes longer, we adjust." Nina glanced up at him. "You say that like you expect it to." Victor didn't answer right away. "I prepare for possibilities." "That's not the same as expecting." "No," he said. "But it usually leads to the same result." She studied him for a moment, then looked back down at the contract. "I went to see my father," she said. "He asked me what I was thinking about." "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing useful." Victor watched her, waiting. "He told me something," she added after a second. "He said if I take something on, it has to be something I can walk away from." Victor's expression didn't change. "That's reasonable." "Is it?" she asked, looking up at him again. "Because this doesn't feel like something people just walk away from. You're overestimating it, and you're underestimating it." The words landed cleanly between them. Victor stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to shift the space again. "It's a role," he said. "It begins. It ends. That's all." "That's not how people work," Nina replied. "It is when they understand the terms." She held his gaze. "Do you?" A brief pause. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. That didn't mean it was simple. Nina looked down again, scanning the contract more carefully this time. Legal language. Structured. Precise. There were no emotional gaps in it. No uncertainty. Just clear lines and defined limits. 7 days, she said. Yes. No personal involvement beyond what's required. Yes. No obligations after the agreement ends. Yes. Nina let out a quiet breath. You've done this before. Victor's gaze shifted slightly, but only for a moment. No. You wrote this like you have. I write everything like it matters. That answer felt closer to the truth. Nina nodded once, then set the contract back down on the desk. If I do this, she said, her voice steady now. There are conditions. Victor didn't look surprised. Go on. I don't move into your room, she said. I keep my space. My job stays the same outside of what we agree to. Done. I'm not on call, she continued. If we're in front of your family, I do what's necessary. Outside of that, I decide where the line is. Victor considered that for a moment. Within reason. Within my reason, she corrected. His eyes held hers. Then he nodded once. Agreed, Nina continued, her confidence building slightly with each word. And when the week ends, it ends. No extensions unless I agree to them. That's already in the contract. I want to hear you say it. Victor didn't hesitate. When the week ends, it ends. Unless you choose otherwise. That word again, choose. Nina took that in, then gave a small nod. Okay. Silence settled for a moment, but it wasn't uncertain anymore. It felt decided. Victor gestured lightly toward the contract. Then sign it. Nina didn't move right away. She reached for the pen instead, turning it once between her fingers like she was testing the weight of it. This was the part that mattered. Not the conversation, not the number. This, a line. She thought of her father's hand earlier, the way it had still held onto hers even when everything else was slipping. She thought of the hospital room, of the number the woman had said like it was just information. 87,000. Time. Nina placed the pen down on the paper, her name already printed neatly at the bottom. For a brief second, her hand paused. You're sure about this? Victor asked. She didn't look up. No. Good, he said. That made her glance at him. Certainty leads to mistakes, he added. This is a decision, not a guarantee. Nina let out a quiet breath. That's one way to look at it. It's the only way that matters. She didn't argue with that. Instead, she signed. The movement was simple, clean, final. Nina Carter. She set the pen down, then stepped back slightly, as if creating space between herself and what she had just done. Victor picked up the contract, scanning the signature briefly, before folding it once and placing it back into the envelope. No ceremony. No reaction. Just completion. When do we start? She asked. He looked at her. And for the first time since she had walked into the room, there was something almost like approval in his expression. Not warm, not soft, just aligned. We already did, he said. Nina felt that settle somewhere deeper than she expected. Victor moved toward the door, then paused. There's a dinner tomorrow evening, he added. My family will be there. Of course they will. You'll need something appropriate to wear. I have clothes. Not for this. Nina almost smiled. Then I guess I'll learn. Victor studied her for a second, then nodded once. Be ready at 6. He opened the door, signaling the conversation was over. Nina walked out without looking back this time. The hallway felt the same. The house felt the same. Nothing had changed, except everything had. She wasn't just working there anymore. She was part of something she didn't fully understand yet, and for the first time since the morning, Nina realized something else. She hadn't walked away. She had stepped in. Nina spent the rest of the evening working as if nothing had changed, which was the only way she knew how to keep herself steady. She cleaned the guest rooms, checked inventory in the kitchen, and followed the routine she had memorized over the past 11 days, but every task felt slightly off, like she was moving through a version of her life that no longer fully belonged to her. No one said anything to her, but she noticed the subtle shifts, how the head housekeeper paused half a second longer when giving instructions. How one of the servers glanced at her with quiet curiosity. News didn't travel fast in a house like this, but it always traveled. At 5:45 the next evening, Nina stood in her small room on the staff floor, staring at the dress laid carefully across her bed. It hadn't been there that morning. Someone had delivered it while she was working downstairs, along with a pair of heels and a simple note with no signature. 6 o'clock. She reached out and touched the fabric. Dark green, understated but precise, the kind of dress that didn't ask for attention but received it anyway. It wasn't something she would have chosen, which meant it was exactly right for where she was going. You're really doing this? Nina turned at the voice. It was Clara, one of the older housemaids, standing in the doorway with her arms loosely crossed. She had been working there long enough to recognize changes before they were explained. I signed something, Nina said, which wasn't quite an answer. Clara stepped inside, closing the door behind her. That's not the same thing. No, Nina agreed. It's not. Clara's eyes moved to the dress. Then back to Nina. You know what kind of house this is? I'm starting to. And him? Clara asked. You know what kind of man he is? Nina paused for a second. I know what people say. Clara gave a small nod. People don't usually say enough. The room went quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Clara wasn't trying to scare her. She was reminding her. You can still back out, Clara said after a moment. Nina looked at the dress again. No, she said quietly. I can't. Clara studied her face, then let out a slow breath. Then don't forget who you are while you're playing someone else. Nina met her eyes. I won't. Clara gave a faint, almost approving nod, then turned and left without another word. By the time Nina finished getting ready, it was exactly 6. She stepped into the hallway, the heels unfamiliar but manageable. Her posture instinctively adjusting to something she didn't quite recognize yet. When she reached the main floor, Victor was already waiting. He didn't say anything at first. His eyes moved over her once. Not slowly, not lingering, just evaluating. Then he gave a small nod, as if something had aligned with his expectations. This works, he said. Nina resisted the urge to ask what that meant. Good. He stepped closer, stopping just within reach. Before we leave, there are a few things you should understand. About your family. Yes. Nina crossed her arms lightly, then uncrossed them again, aware of the gesture. I figured. They will ask questions, Victor continued. Not directly, not at first. They prefer to observe before they decide what they think. That sounds efficient. It is. And what do they think right now? She asked. That I'm avoiding something, he said. Which I am. Nina nodded once. So I'm the solution. You're the answer they didn't expect. She held his gaze. That doesn't mean they'll accept it. No, Victor said. It doesn't. A brief silence settled between them. What's my story? Nina asked. Victor didn't hesitate. We met through work. That part's true. It helps, he said. We kept it private because I don't mix personal matters with business. That part sounds like you, Nina replied. It is, he said simply. And how long have we been together? She asked. 6 months. Nina let out a small breath. That's not subtle. Subtle doesn't hold under pressure, he said. Consistency does. She nodded, taking that in. 6 months. She repeated. And your family hasn't met me because I didn't want them to, Victor said. Nina raised an eyebrow slightly. That's honest. They won't believe anything less. She almost smiled at that, but it faded quickly. And what happens when they ask why now? Victor looked at her, something sharper behind his calm expression. Then you tell them I finally decided you were worth the conversation. Nina held his gaze a second longer than she should have. That's not a small thing to say. It's not meant to be. The weight of that settled between them. Not entirely comfortable, but not avoidable either. Victor stepped closer again, this time reaching for her hand. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but not rough. His fingers closed around hers, adjusting slightly as if testing the fit. You need to stop reacting every time I touch you, he said quietly. I'm not reacting, Nina replied. You are, he said. It's subtle, but it's there. Nina looked down at their hands, then back up at him. Then I'll work on it. You don't work on it, he corrected. You decide. She exhaled slowly. That's easy for you to say. Yes, he said. It is. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he released her hand, just as deliberately as he had taken it. We'll leave now, he said. The drive to Lake Geneva was quiet. Victor didn't feel silence unless it served a purpose, and Nina didn't feel the need to break it. She watched the city fade into darker roads, then into stretches of quiet neighborhoods where the houses grew larger, older, more deliberate in their presence. This is where you grew up, she said after a while. Yes. And you still come back here? It's expected. Do you like it? Victor glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. That's not the question that matters. Nina nodded slightly. Fair. They arrived just after sunset. The house stood back from the road, large without being showy, the kind of place that didn't need to prove anything. Lights glowed from inside, warm and steady, but Nina could already feel the difference. This wasn't just a house, it was a system, a history. Victor parked, then stepped out without hesitation. Nina followed. The gravel beneath her heels unfamiliar but manageable. He walked around to her side and held out his hand. Not as an offer. As an expectation, she took it. "Relax your shoulders," he said quietly as they approached the entrance. "I'm relaxed." "You're not," Nina exhaled. "I'm working on it. That's not what I said to do." She almost smiled at that, but instead she adjusted slightly, letting her shoulders drop just enough to feel natural. "Better," he said. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman stood there, composed, observant, her expression calm but far from passive. "Victor," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "Mother." Her gaze shifted to Nina, taking her in without apology. It wasn't rude, it was precise. "And this is?" she asked. Victor's hand tightened slightly around Nina's, just enough to anchor the moment. "This is Nina," he said, "my girlfriend." The word landed in the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Nina met the woman's gaze, steady, careful, aware of every movement in the room that she hadn't even stepped into yet. For the first time since she signed the contract, she understood something clearly. This wasn't about pretending. It was about being believed. Nina didn't speak first. She let the silence sit just long enough to feel intentional, not hesitant, her hand still resting in Victor's as if it belonged there. The woman at the door, his mother, it had to be watched her with a level of attention that didn't miss details. Not the dress, not the posture, not the fact that Nina hadn't tried to pull her hand away. "Good evening," Nina said finally, her tone polite but steady. "It's nice to meet you." There was a brief pause before the woman responded, as if measuring not just the words, but the space between them. "Evelyn Moretti," she said. "And I imagine it is." Victor didn't react to the tone, which meant it was expected. Evelyn stepped aside, allowing them in without another word. The interior of the house was warmer than outside, but not softer. Everything had its place, from the artwork to the lighting, each detail deliberate rather than decorative. Nina noticed it all without staring. That was part of the role now. Awareness without curiosity. As they moved further inside, voices carried faintly from another room. Family, already gathered. Victor leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that it didn't travel. "Stay close." "I figured," Nina replied. His hand shifted from hers to the small of her back, guiding rather than holding. The gesture was subtle, but it changed the dynamic immediately. To anyone watching, it wasn't control, it was familiarity. They entered the main room together. Conversation paused, not abruptly, but enough to register their presence. Two women and one man turned toward them. The resemblance was clear. Same posture, same measured attention. Finally, one of the women said, a hint of amusement in her voice, "You decided to show up with a surprise." Victor didn't release Nina. "This isn't a surprise. This is Nina." There was something in the way he said her name this time, less formal, more grounded. The man stepped forward first, offering a hand. "Daniel," he said, "you've been a topic of conversation longer than you think." Nina shook his hand, firm but not overly so. "I hope that's not a bad thing." Daniel smiled slightly. "Depends who you ask." "That's honest," she said. One of the women moved closer, her eyes sharper, more openly curious. "I'm Elena," she said, "and I have questions." "I assumed you would," Nina replied. That earned the smallest shift in expression. Not approval, but interest. 6 months, Elena said, glancing briefly at Victor. "That's what he told us." Nina nodded. "That's right. And you thought now was the right time to meet us?" Evelyn's voice came from behind them, calm, but precise. Nina turned slightly to face her. "It wasn't about timing," she said. "It was about being ready." "For what?" Evelyn asked. "For this," Nina answered simply. The room went quiet again, but not uncomfortably. It felt like something had just been placed on the table, something everyone was now examining from different angles. Victor's hand remained steady at her back, not pressing, not pulling, just there. "Dinner's ready," Daniel said after a moment, breaking the tension without dismissing it. They moved toward the dining room together. Nina stayed in step with Victor, aware of every glance, every subtle shift in attention. This wasn't hostility. It was evaluation. There was a difference. At the table, she took the seat beside Victor without hesitation. No one directed her. That mattered. Dinner started normally enough. Conversation moved between business, family updates, small observations that didn't require full attention. Nina listened more than she spoke at first, which gave her time to understand the rhythm of the room. Evelyn led most of it without raising her voice. Elena interrupted when she felt like it. Daniel observed, stepping in only when necessary. Victor spoke the least, but when he did, the conversation adjusted. "Where are you from, Nina?" Evelyn asked after a while, setting her glass down with quiet precision. "Chicago," Nina said. "South Side." "Not where I expected," Elena commented. Nina glanced at her briefly. "Most people don't." "And what do you do?" Evelyn continued. Nina paused just long enough to feel deliberate. "I work in property management," she said. Not entirely untrue, not entirely the truth. Victor didn't react. "Practical," Daniel said. "It pays the bills," Nina replied. Evelyn watched her for a moment. "And Victor fits into that how?" Nina didn't look at him when she answered. "He doesn't," she said. "That's kind of the point." That shifted something. Elena leaned back slightly, studying her. "You're not intimidated." "I'm aware," Nina corrected. "Of what?" Elena asked. "Of where I am," Nina said, "and who I'm talking to." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something in her posture eased just slightly. Not acceptance. Not yet. But less resistance. "And him?" Evelyn asked, nodding faintly toward Victor. "Are you aware of him?" Nina turned her head then, meeting Victor's eyes for just a second before looking back. "I am," she said. Victor's gaze lingered on her a fraction longer than necessary. It was subtle, but it was there. Dinner continued, but the questions became more precise, less casual. Nina answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't, and stayed consistent. That was the key. Not perfection, consistency. At one point, Victor reached for his glass and his hand brushed hers. Nina didn't pull away. She didn't react at all. She let it happen like it was normal. He noticed. Under the table, his hand found hers again, this time intentionally. His fingers laced with hers, the gesture easy, practiced. Not for her, for them. Nina let her hand settle into his without hesitation. Across the table, Elena saw it. Nina knew because of the way her gaze shifted, just slightly. "Interesting," Elena said quietly. Victor didn't look up. "What is?" "You," she replied. "You don't usually do this." "Do what?" "Look comfortable," she said. Victor finally glanced at her. "I am." Elena's eyes flicked to Nina, then back. "That's new." "It's accurate," Victor said. The conversation moved on, but the moment stayed. By the time dinner ended, Nina felt the weight of the evening settle into something clearer. She hadn't been dismissed. She hadn't been accepted either. But she had held her place. That was enough for now. As they stepped away from the table, Victor's hand returned to her back, guiding her toward the hallway. The movement was automatic now, less deliberate, more natural. "You did well," he said quietly once they were out of earshot. Nina exhaled slowly. "I did what we agreed." "That's not the same thing." She glanced at him. "No?" "No," he said. "You made them think." Nina let that sit for a second. "Is that good?" Victor looked at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. "It is when they can't decide what to think." She nodded slightly. "Then I guess we're on track." For a moment neither of them moved. Then Nina added, more quietly, "You didn't correct anything I said." "There was nothing to correct," he replied. "That's not true," she said. "I adjusted things." Victor's gaze held hers. So did I. The honesty in that landed differently than the rest of the night. From somewhere deeper in the house, voices rose again, lighter this time, less focused. The pressure of the evening had shifted. Nina looked down briefly, then back up. "This part," she said, "the part where they're deciding, it doesn't stop, does it?" Victor shook his head slightly. "No. It just changes." "Into what?" "Something harder to predict." Nina let out a quiet breath. "Good." Victor raised an eyebrow slightly. "You think so?" She met his gaze. Steady now in a way she hadn't been before. "I don't want this to be easy for them." A faint shift crossed his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything she could name. "Neither do I," he said. And for the first time since this started, Nina believed that part wasn't part of the arrangement. The evening didn't end when dinner did. That was the first thing Nina realized as voices carried into the adjoining lounge, softer now but not less intentional. This wasn't a family that relaxed easily. They transitioned from one form of observation to another. Victor didn't let go of her hand as they stepped into the next room. The lighting was dimmer there, warmer, designed for conversation that lasted longer than it should. A fire burned low in the fireplace, more for atmosphere than heat. Glasses were already being poured. "You drink?" Elena asked, holding up a bottle of wine as Nina approached. "Occasionally," Nina said. Elena poured anyway, handing her a glass with a look that was more testing than welcoming. "Tonight counts as an occasion." Nina accepted it with a small nod. "That seems fair." Victor released her hand then, but not completely. His fingers brushed hers once. A quiet signal rather than a separation. Nina noticed it. She didn't react. They settled into the room in a loose arrangement. No assigned seats, but positions still mattered. Evelyn took the chair near the fireplace. Daniel leaned against the far wall. Elena moved where she could see everyone at once. Victor remained standing for a moment, then finally sat, close enough to Nina that the space between them didn't feel accidental. "You've been quiet," Daniel said after a while, looking at Nina over the rim of his glass. "I've been listening," she replied. "That's not the same thing," he said. "It is when you're new," Nina answered. Elena smiled faintly at that. "You don't feel new." "I am," Nina said. "I just don't act like it." "That's either confidence," Elena said, "or something else." Nina took a small sip of her drink. "It's experience." "With what?" Evelyn asked, her voice calm but pointed. Nina met her gaze. "Walking into rooms where I'm not expected." That landed. Victor didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Evelyn studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. "And you've been doing that for 6 months?" she asked. Nina didn't hesitate. "Not like this." "Meaning?" Elena pressed. "Meaning this room," Nina said, gesturing lightly, "comes with a different kind of attention." "And you're comfortable with that?" Evelyn asked. Nina set her glass down on the table beside her. "Comfort isn't the goal," she said. "Understanding is." A quiet pause followed. Victor shifted slightly beside her, his shoulder brushing hers just enough to be noticeable. It wasn't a correction. It felt more like alignment. Elena leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on her knees. "So you understand him?" she asked, nodding toward Victor. Nina glanced at him briefly, then back at Elena. "I understand how he moves through the world." "That's not the same as understanding him," Elena said. "No," Nina agreed. "It's not." "Then what do you understand?" Evelyn asked. Nina considered that for a moment, not rushing the answer. "That he doesn't waste time," she said. "That when he makes a decision, he doesn't revisit it unless something changes." Victor's gaze shifted to her, sharper now. "And?" Evelyn prompted. "And that he doesn't bring people into his personal life without a reason," Nina added. Silence followed that one. Elena leaned back slightly. "That sounds like something he told you." Nina shook her head. "No, that's something I noticed." Victor's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Daniel let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "You're observant." "I have to be," Nina said. "It's part of how I work." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disapproval, but in focus. "And what do you think the reason is?" she asked. Nina didn't look at Victor this time. "For bringing me here?" "Yes." Nina held Evelyn's gaze. "Because not bringing me would have created more questions than bringing me does." That answer shifted the room again. Elena smiled, but it wasn't light. "That's not romantic." "No," Nina said. "It's practical." Victor finally spoke, his voice even. "Romance isn't what this is about." Evelyn looked at him. "Then what is it about?" Victor didn't look away. "Clarity." The word settled, heavy but precise. Nina felt it too. Clarity. That was what this had been from the beginning. Not comfort, not ease. Something else. Elena glanced between them. "You two sound very aligned." "We are," Victor said. Nina didn't contradict him. The conversation shifted after that, moving into less direct territory. Stories from the past, references Nina didn't fully understand but followed well enough. She spoke when it made sense, stayed quiet when it didn't, and kept her attention steady. At one point, Daniel asked her about her work again, this time more casually. Property management, he said. That keeps you busy? It does, Nina replied. And you plan to stay in that? For now. Elena raised an eyebrow. That sounds temporary. Everything is, Nina said. Victor's gaze flicked to her again, brief but noticeable. Evelyn watched that exchange, then said quietly, temporary things have a way of becoming permanent if people aren't careful. Nina met her eyes. Only if they stop paying attention. Another pause. Victor stood then, reaching for Nina's glass before she could, setting it aside without asking. That's enough for tonight, he said. It wasn't a suggestion. Elena tilted her head slightly. You're ending the conversation? I'm ending the evening, Victor corrected. Evelyn didn't argue. She simply stood as well, smoothing her dress with a small, controlled movement. We'll continue this another time, she said to Nina. Nina nodded. I'll be here. Evelyn's expression shifted just slightly at that. Yes, she said. You will. Daniel gave Nina a small nod on his way out. Elena lingered a second longer, studying her with something like curiosity that hadn't settled into judgment yet. Interesting, Elena said quietly. Very interesting. Then she followed the others out. The room grew quieter once they were gone. The fire still burned, low and steady, the only sound left. Nina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That went, well, she said. Victor looked at her, his expression unreadable. It went as expected. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It's not. Nina stood, adjusting slightly as the tension left her shoulders. Your mother doesn't miss anything. No, Victor agreed. She doesn't. And your sister, Nina added. She's not convinced. She doesn't need to be, he said. She will want to be. Victor studied her for a moment. You're thinking ahead. I have to, Nina replied. You said they don't decide right away. They don't. Then this continues, she said. Victor nodded once. Yes. Nina looked around the room, then back at him. And the longer it continues, the less it looks like an arrangement. Victor didn't answer immediately. That's the point, he said finally. Nina held his gaze, something quieter settling beneath the surface of her thoughts. And when it stops? She asked. Victor's expression didn't change, but there was a slight pause this time. Not hesitation. Something else. It stops, he said. Simple. Clean. Final. Nina nodded slowly, but the answer didn't settle as easily as it should have. For the first time since she signed the contract, she realized something had shifted. It wasn't just about convincing his family anymore. It was about how long they could keep convincing themselves. The drive back was quieter than the one that brought them there. Nina didn't ask questions this time, and Victor didn't offer explanations. The road stretched ahead in long, dim lines, the occasional headlights passing like brief interruptions that didn't linger. Nina rested her hand loosely in her lap, aware of the space between them in a way she hadn't been earlier. It wasn't distance. It was something harder to define. You didn't warn me about your sister, she said after a while. Her voice calm but not light. Victor kept his eyes on the road. I did. No, Nina replied. You said they would observe, she interrogates. A faint shift crossed his expression. That's her version of observing. Nina let out a quiet breath. She's not convinced. She's not supposed to be. That doesn't mean she'll stop, Nina said. Victor glanced at her briefly. She won't. Nina nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. Then we'll have to be better. Victor didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. You already are, he said finally. Nina turned her head slightly, studying him for a moment. That sounded like approval. It was an observation. That's not the same thing. It is when I don't repeat it, he said. Nina almost smiled, but the expression didn't fully form. She looked back out the window, watching the lights thin into darkness again. When they reached the estate, the house felt different. Not physically. The same lights, the same quiet, the same controlled rhythm of staff moving through their routines. But Nina stepped inside knowing something had shifted. Not in the house. In her. Victor didn't stop in the foyer. My office, he said, already moving. Nina followed without question. Inside, the room was exactly as it had been earlier that day. Orderly, controlled. The contract was no longer on the desk. That detail didn't escape her. Victor closed the door behind them, then turned to face her. We need to adjust. Nina crossed her arms lightly, then dropped them again. Because of your sister. Because of what she noticed, he corrected. And what did she notice? Nina asked. Victor stepped closer, stopping just within reach again. That you think before you respond, he said. That you don't defer unless you choose to. That you're not trying to impress them. Nina tilted her head slightly. Those are problems? They're differences, Victor said. Differences draw attention. Nina considered that. You want me to change? I want you to be consistent, he replied. With what? With me. The answer came quickly. Nina held his gaze. Then you'll have to be clearer. Victor didn't look away. In front of them, I don't hesitate with you. I don't question you. I don't create space. Nina's brow lifted slightly. You mean this, she said, gesturing lightly between them. Yes. And outside of that? She asked. Victor paused, just briefly. Outside of that, it doesn't matter. The answer was expected. That didn't make it easier to hear. Nina nodded once. Okay. Victor studied her for a moment longer. You're thinking about something. I'm always thinking about something, she replied. That one's different. Nina exhaled slowly. Your mother. Victor didn't react, but his attention sharpened slightly. She didn't push, Nina continued. Not directly. She doesn't need to. No, Nina agreed. She waits. Victor nodded once. Yes. Nina stepped back slightly, creating just enough distance to think clearly. That's worse. It's more effective, he said. She's not trying to prove I don't belong, Nina added. She's waiting for me to prove it myself. Victor didn't interrupt. Nina met his eyes again. That changes things. How? He asked. It means she's not looking for mistakes, Nina said. She's looking for patterns. Victor's expression shifted, just slightly. And if something doesn't line up, she'll notice, Nina said. Not immediately, but eventually. Victor took that in, then nodded once. You're right. Nina let out a small breath. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. Silence settled again, but this time it felt more focused, more intentional. Nina glanced around the room, then back at him. There's something else. Victor waited. When your sister mentioned you looking comfortable, Nina said, you didn't correct her. I didn't need to. Because it wasn't wrong? Nina asked. Victor held her gaze. Because it wasn't relevant. Nina didn't respond right away. She studied him instead, as if trying to see past the answer to what was behind it. Everything's relevant in that room, she said finally. Victor didn't disagree. The silence that followed stretched longer than the others. Not uncomfortable, just heavier. Nina shifted slightly, her posture relaxing in a way that wasn't entirely deliberate. This part, she said quieter now. Where we adjust. Where we get better at this. It doesn't stay separate. Victor's eyes narrowed just slightly. Explain. It carries over, Nina said, into everything else. Victor took a step closer, closing the space she had created. Only if you let it. Nina didn't move. That's not entirely true. No? He asked. No, she said, because people notice patterns, not moments. Victor watched her carefully now. You're thinking like them. I'm thinking ahead. Nina corrected. Another pause. Victor reached for her hand again, this time more deliberately than before. His fingers closed around hers, steady, controlled. Nina didn't pull away. She didn't tense either. She let it happen. That's what I mean, he said quietly. Nina looked down at their hands, then back up at him. I know. Her voice was softer now, but not uncertain. Victor's grip didn't tighten, but it didn't loosen either. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Nina spoke again, her tone shifting slightly. I'm going to say something. And you're not going to like it. Victor raised an eyebrow just slightly. Go ahead. This is getting easier, she said. Victor didn't respond immediately. That's not a good thing, Nina added. Why? He asked. Because it's not supposed to be easy, she said. Not if it's temporary. Victor's gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. You're assuming ease changes the terms. It changes the perception, Nina replied. And that matters to you? He asked. Nina didn't hesitate. It has to. Another silence. But this one felt different, not just measured. Charged. Victor finally released her hand, the movement slow enough to register. Then don't let it change, he said. Nina watched him for a moment, then nodded once. I won't. But something in the way she said it wasn't as certain as the words. Victor turned slightly, moving back toward the desk. "There's an event in 2 days," he said. "More public, more visible." Nina took that in. "Bigger audience." "Yes, and more people watching for patterns," she added. Victor nodded. "Exactly." Nina let out a quiet breath. "Then we'll give them one." Victor glanced at her, something faint and sharp in his expression. "We will." Nina turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back at him. "You're right about one thing," she said. "What's that?" Victor asked. She held his gaze, steady, controlled. "This isn't about pretending anymore." Victor didn't respond. Nina opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, closing it behind her with a soft, controlled motion. As she walked away, she realized something that hadn't been clear before. It wasn't just about convincing his family. It was about how long she could keep convincing herself that she wasn't starting to believe it too. The event was exactly what Nina expected, and nothing she could fully prepare for. It was held the following evening in a private venue overlooking the lake, the kind of place designed to look effortless while everything beneath it was controlled down to the smallest detail. Soft lighting, quiet music, conversations that carried just far enough to be overheard if someone wanted them to be. This wasn't just a gathering. It was a stage. Victor didn't say much during the drive there. He didn't need to. Nina had already understood what this night required. Not just consistency, visibility. This was where patterns became narratives. When the car stopped, Victor stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand. The gesture was expected now. Practiced. Nina placed her hand in his, without hesitation. "Shoulders," he said quietly. "Relaxed," she replied. "Stay that way." Nina stepped out, the evening air cooler than she expected, carrying the faint sound of water against the dock below. The building ahead was already alive with movement. People arriving, people watching arrivals. Conversations beginning before introductions were made. Victor's hand shifted from hers to the small of her back as they walked in. The contact was steady, familiar enough now that Nina didn't have to think about it. That was the part that bothered her, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for that. Inside, the room adjusted when they entered. Not dramatically, but enough. Conversations didn't stop, but they slowed. Eyes moved, then moved away, then returned. Moretti, a man greeted from across the room, raising a glass slightly. Victor nodded once. Carver, no introduction, no explanation, just recognition. Nina stayed close, her posture aligned with his, her attention steady without appearing alert. She could feel the shift in atmosphere already. This wasn't family. This was something else. Reputation, influence, people who didn't ask questions directly because they already had their own answers. "Stay with me," Victor said quietly. "I am," Nina replied. They moved through the room slowly. Victor stopped occasionally, exchanging brief conversations, none of them long enough to settle into anything comfortable. Nina listened, spoke when necessary, and matched his pace without needing direction. It didn't take long before the attention narrowed. "She's new," a woman's voice said nearby, not bothering to lower itself enough. Nina didn't turn. She didn't need to. The comment wasn't meant for her. It was meant to be heard. Victor didn't react either. "That's one way to put it," another voice replied, softer, but sharper. Nina let her hand shift slightly, brushing against Victor's wrist. He adjusted immediately, his fingers closing around hers like it was instinct, not response. To anyone watching, it looked natural. "She belongs to him," the first voice added. Nina almost smiled at that. Not because it was true, because it was effective. Victor's grip tightened just enough to register. Not a warning, a signal. "You're thinking," he said under his breath. "I always am," Nina replied. "Focus." "I am." Victor glanced at her briefly, then back at the room. "Good." A man approached them, older, composed, carrying himself with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. "Victor," he said. "I didn't expect you to attend." "I was invited," Victor replied. The man's gaze shifted to Nina. "And you are?" "Nina," she said, meeting his eyes directly. He waited a fraction longer than necessary. "Just Nina?" "For now," she said. That earned a faint, almost amused reaction. Bold, he said. Honest, Nina replied. Victor didn't interrupt. The man nodded once, as if filing that away. We'll see how that holds, he said, then moved on. Nina exhaled quietly once he was gone. That wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be, Victor said. And you handled it, he replied. Nina glanced at him. You sound surprised. I'm not. Then don't say it like you are. A brief pause. Victor's expression shifted slightly. Noted. They moved further into the room, the conversations changing as they went. Nina noticed how people adjusted around Victor. Not fear. Not exactly. Respect. But calculated. Measured. Your world is structured, she said quietly. That's one word for it. And what's the other? She asked. Controlled, Victor replied. Nina nodded. I can see that. And you? He asked. Where do you fit into it? Nina looked ahead, her voice steady. Right now? Wherever you need me to. Victor's gaze lingered on her for a second longer than expected. That's not how you think, he said. No, Nina agreed. But it's how this works. Victor didn't argue with that. The evening continued. But the tone shifted again when Elena arrived. Nina noticed her before Victor did, not because she was looking for her, but because Elena didn't enter rooms quietly. She stepped in like she already knew what she would find. Elena, Victor said as she approached. Victor, she replied, then turned to Nina. And you? Nina held her Gaza. Me. Elena studied her for a moment, then glanced around the room. You're doing well, she said. That sounds like a test result, Nina replied. It is, Elena said, and you passed dinner. This is different. I can tell, Nina said. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough. People here don't ask who you are, she said. They decide. And? Nina asked. Elena's eyes flicked briefly to Victor, then back. They haven't decided yet. Nina nodded slightly. That's fine. Elena's expression shifted, something sharper behind it. You're not worried. I'm focused, Nina corrected. Elena smiled faintly. That's either very smart or very dangerous. Maybe both, Nina said. Victor stepped in then, his hand returning to Nina's back, more firmly this time. That's enough, he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. Protective? Practical, Victor replied. Elena looked between them, then nodded once. We'll talk later, she said to Nina, before stepping away. Nina watched her go, then exhaled slowly. She's not going to stop. No, Victor said. And this is the part where it gets harder, Nina added. Victor didn't deny it. Nina shifted slightly, her posture still steady, but something beneath it tightening. You said this would be visible, she said. It is. This is more than visible, she replied. This is positioning. Victor looked at her. Yes, Nina let that settle. Then we're not just convincing your family anymore. No, Victor said. Who are we convincing? She asked. Victor's gaze moved across the room, then back to her. Everyone who's watching. Nina followed his line of sight. There were more of them than she realized. Not obvious, but present. Her hand tightened slightly in his. This time, it wasn't entirely controlled. Victor noticed. Stay with me, he said again. Quieter now. I am, Nina replied, but there was something different in her voice. Victor's hand shifted, steadying, grounding, not for the room, for her. Nina took a breath, then another, letting the noise settle back into something she could manage. This isn't just a week, she said quietly. Victor didn't answer immediately. No, he said finally. The word didn't come with explanation. Nina looked at him, really looked this time. You knew that. Another pause. Victor didn't look away. I knew it could become more. More what? She asked. He held her gaze, steady and controlled. More complicated. Nina let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and something else. That's one way to say it. Victor didn't respond. The room continued around them, conversations flowing, people watching, decisions forming in places Nina couldn't see. And for the first time since she signed the contract, the number didn't feel like the center of it anymore. Something else had taken its place, something she hadn't agreed to, and wasn't sure she could walk away from. The room didn't feel the same by the time the night began to thin. Conversations softened, glasses emptied, and people started leaving in measured intervals that looked casual but weren't. Nothing in Victor's world ended abruptly. It dissolved, Slowly and with intention, Nina stayed beside him through it all, her posture steady, her responses controlled, but something inside her had shifted beyond adjustment. She felt it in the way her thoughts didn't return to the contract, to the number, to the clear edges that had defined this from the beginning. Those edges were still there. They just didn't feel as solid anymore. "Ready?" Victor asked quietly as the last of the guests began to move toward the exit. Nina nodded. Yes. He didn't take her hand immediately this time. Instead, he let her walk beside him, the space between them smaller than it had been before, but not entirely closed. It was a subtle difference, one that only she seemed to notice. Outside, the air was colder, cleaner. The lake stretched out into darkness, reflecting only fragments of light from the building behind them. For a moment, neither of them moved toward the car. Nina exhaled slowly. That was different. Victor glanced at her. "You expected it to be the same?" "No," she said, "but I didn't expect it to feel like that either." "Like what?" he asked. Nina took a second before answering. "Like I was being placed." Victor didn't respond immediately. "You were." She let out a quiet breath. "I figured." They stood there a moment longer before he opened the car door for her. Nina slid in without comment, her thoughts quieter now but heavier. The drive back felt longer. Victor didn't turn on the radio. He rarely did. Silence, in his world, wasn't something to fill. It was something to use. Nina understood that now. But tonight it felt different. Not strategic, just present. "You knew," she said finally, her voice low but clear. Victor didn't look at her. "I said that already." "No," Nina replied. "You said it could become more. That's not the same thing as knowing." Victor's hands remained steady on the wheel. "There's always a difference between possibility and certainty. And which one is this?" she asked. Another pause. "Somewhere in between," he said. Nina leaned her head back slightly, staring ahead. "That's not an answer. It's the only accurate one." She didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because she understood what he meant. That space in between, uncertain, shifting, that was where they were now. Not defined. Not contained. "That man earlier," Nina said after a moment. "Carver." Victor nodded once. "Yes. He wasn't just asking who I was," she said. "He was deciding what I represent." Victor glanced at her briefly. "That's how it works." "And what do I represent?" Nina asked. Victor's gaze returned to the road. "That depends on how you're seen." "That's not what I asked." Another silence, longer this time. Finally, Victor said, "You represent change." Nina let that sit for a second. "That sounds like a problem." "It can be." "And for you?" she asked. Victor's jaw shifted slightly. "It's already happening." The words landed differently than the rest. Not calculated, not entirely controlled. Nina turned her head, studying him more closely now. "You don't like that." "I don't like variables I didn't plan," he said. "And I'm one of those." "Yes." There was no hesitation. Nina nodded slowly, then looked away again. "At least you're honest about it." "I don't have a reason not to be." "That's not true," she said. "You always have a reason." Victor didn't respond to that. The car moved through the dark roads, the estate growing closer with each passing minute. Nina felt something tightening again, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't pressure from outside. It was something internal, something harder to name. "When this ends," she said quietly, "it's not going to be clean." Victor didn't answer right away. "No," he said eventually. Nina let out a small breath. "That's the first time you've said that." "It's the first time it mattered," he replied. They pulled into the estate shortly after. The house was quiet again, the lights softer, the night settling into something still. Victor turned off the engine, but neither of them moved immediately. Nina looked ahead, her hands resting loosely in her lap. "You said this was about clarity." "It is. This doesn't feel clear anymore," she said. Victor turned his head toward her. "Clarity doesn't mean simplicity." Nina almost smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That sounds like something you tell yourself." "It's something I've learned." She nodded slightly. "Then maybe this is the part where it stops being a lesson." Victor watched her, his expression steady but not unreadable anymore. There was something beneath it now. Not fully visible. But there. "You can still walk away," he said. The words came quieter than she expected. Nina turned to him, holding his gaze. Can I? Yes. The answer was immediate. But you don't want me to, she said. Victor didn't respond. That was enough of an answer. Nina looked away first this time, her thoughts moving faster than she could sort through them. That's the problem, she said. What is? Victor asked. You don't say things you don't mean, she replied. So when you don't say something, it still means something, he finished. Nina nodded once. Exactly. Silence filled the space again, but it wasn't empty. Finally, Nina reached for the door handle, then paused. This started as a solution, she said. Yes. It doesn't feel like one anymore. Victor's voice was low when he answered. No. Nina opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. She didn't look back right away. She needed a second to steady herself, to put something back into place that had shifted too far. Victor stepped out as well, closing the door behind him. Nina. She turned then. He stood a few feet away, not close enough to touch, but not distant either. The space between them felt intentional now, not part of the act. We finish what we started, he said. Nina studied him, her expression calm but not unguarded. Do we? Yes. And after that? She asked. Victor held her gaze. We decide. Nina let out a slow breath, something almost like acceptance settling into her posture. Not comfort, not certainty, just acknowledgement. That's new, she said. Victor didn't deny it. For a moment, they stood there, the night quiet around them, the house behind them, the path forward no longer as defined as it had been. Nina finally nodded once. Then we finish it. She turned and walked toward the entrance, her step steady, her pace controlled. Victor watched her for a second longer before following. Inside, everything looked the same, but nothing was. Sometimes life doesn't offer us clean choices, only necessary ones. This story reminds us that power, money, and control may shape the world around us, but they don't define the truth inside us. Real strength is not in forcing outcomes, but in choosing with awareness, even when the cost is high. Love, when it is real, cannot be negotiated like a contract. It reveals itself in the moments where people risk losing everything just to remain honest. And in the end, dignity is not about walking away from hard situations, but about not losing yourself while you stay. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.